Hey there, drone fans. Rick here again from Drone Valley. In today's clip, I'll cover the proper care and feeding of one of the most expensive and potentially most dangerous accessories you'll buy for your quad, the LiPo battery. Now, any quad flyer out there needs to understand how important proper battery care is for keeping your quad up in the air. I mean, if these guys stop producing electrons, that quad is coming down out of the sky. But beyond that, you can make a few simple mistakes with your batteries that'll dramatically reduce their lifespan and in some cases turn them into fairly dangerous devices to be dragging along. So what I'd like to do in this clip today is to start off with an understanding of LiPo technology. I'm going to go into some of the details of the chemistry behind it because these in a lot of ways are miracle devices of chemistry. They really are amazing when you think of the amount of power you can pack into a tiny little package like this that keeps a quad in the air for 25 or 30 minutes. It's just mind-blowing to me. So I get a lot of questions on the channel about how LiPo batteries work and how do they compare to other batteries out there. So I'm going to give you a really short tutorial on what LiPo batteries are about and how they produce the electrons they do to keep the quads flying. But beyond that, I want to spend a few minutes talking about 5 hot topics of things that you can do to damage these batteries over time. Because I mentioned out of the gate that they're the most expensive accessory you're going to buy, and I've got a good collection of them in front of me here, starting with the big ones on the left and the small ones on the right, but there isn't a battery in front of me that's less than $40. Now, it's a bit of a game show, but I'm going to try and go through these and describe them. So I've got a Phantom 4, Phantom 3, Mavic 2, Mavic Pro, that's the Autel Evo, Mavic Air, Spark, and finally the Parrot Anafi. Now, these batteries range in price from, I think, $35, $80 in this one. The Anafi, I think, is close to $100. So if there's something I can do to treat that right and get 10 extra flights, 20 extra flights out of that battery, including reading it a bedtime story, I'm going to take care of that battery because I'm a cheapskate and I don't want to buy batteries before I have to replace them. So the tips and tricks I'm going to give you today will make sure that you take good care of your batteries and you keep them as long as possible to get the best value out of them. The second thing I mentioned was dangerous because LiPo cells in general are very, very safe products. The chemistry is very stable, but there are things you can do to the battery to abuse it and really create almost a fire hand grenade. And I'm not trying to scare you, but if you want to see what a LiPo fire looks like, just Google the word LiPo fire. You're going to find that a battery that combusts will burn incredibly hot, insanely hot, for a very long period of time until all the chemicals are extinguished, and it's very difficult to put out. So if one of these batteries bursts into flame in your living room while you're charging it, you could be in a whole lot of trouble. So I'm going to, again, not to scare you, but I'm going to talk about what you should look for before a battery gets to that state. Now, to that point, what really prompted this conversation is I follow all the rules. I know what I should be doing with the batteries. I promise you, I'm very responsible with my batteries. But lo and behold, the other day, I've got a Mavic Air battery that's got a puffed bottom on it, which means this battery's got to go. That's one of the signs that you're heading towards that sort of fire hand grenade with the LiPo. So this is one I've got to discharge and take to a recycling center. Now, I know what I did wrong, and I'm going to explain that as I go through the clip, but that's frustrating because that's a $50, $60 battery, and dumb guy Rick did something wrong, force that battery to go to a swelling condition, and now I've got to get rid of it. I can't fly with it anymore. So what I like to do on this channel all the time is explain the dumb things I do because I'm an average flyer, so you don't make those same mistakes and you can save the money that I'm not going to be able to save in that particular battery. So I mentioned expensive, I mentioned dangerous. Those are the 2 things I'll cover. Now, the 5 topics I want to go through are things like charging, temperature, storage, transport, and activity. All 5 of those are really simple things to remember. But again, if you take good care of these batteries, you're going to get them a lot of use out of them. You're going to hang on to them for a lot of years, and you'll get better flight times out of them as well. So it's really important to understand, again, what the proper care and feeding required to keep these guys happy, and I want them all happy. So anyway, stay tuned and I'll get into the LiPo section. Then I'll come back and go through those different categories really quickly so you guys can have a fun and exciting summer and keep your batteries as long as possible. A LiPo battery is a fairly simple device that relies on a chemical process for both storing and delivering a charge. The battery is constructed in a flexible container that has a positive electrode and a negative electrode inserted, and then the container is filled with a polymer electrolyte that's a viscous liquid that touches both of those electrodes. In between those electrodes is a semi-porous insulator to keep those 2 electrodes from touching each other. The charge that the LiPo cell delivers happens because lithium ions are moving through that electrolyte between the 2 different electrodes. So for example, during discharge, the actual lithium ions are being stripped off the negative electrode through a process called intercalation and moved to the positive electrode for delivery to the quad. When you're charging the LiPo cell, you're reversing that process and you're actually taking those positive lithium ions off of the positive electrode and forcing it back to the negative side. And that semi-porous insulator between those 2 different electrodes keep them from touching each other and shorting out. The challenge with LiPo cells is they can fail in 2 different ways. over time, these chemicals start to decay and the batteries don't charge as well. So you don't get as much life out of them over time. And again, some of the conditions I'm going to talk about in a few minutes can accelerate that process of decay. Another thing that happens in lipocells, which is fairly unknown at this point, there's a lot of research into this, is a thing called dendrites. Now, dendrites form at those points of intercalation on those two different electrodes inside the battery, and they're basically almost like little lightning bolts of conductivity that manifest themselves inside that electrolyte. So over time, they'll actually branch out like the branches of a tree and try to bridge the positive and negative electrode, causing a short. Now, as those dendrites extend further and further and further, eventually they destroy the ability of that battery to hold a charge. Now, it's really not understood at this point what causes those dendrites and what forces them to grow at different speeds. But one thing's for sure, if you do some things that are bad for the battery, they can increase the number of dendrites that are in there and the size of those dendrites a lot faster than they would occur normally. So it's important that when I explain what you shouldn't be doing with the battery, you try to follow these steps as closely as possible to get the most use out of that battery. In this first section, I'll cover a few things to keep in mind when charging your LiPo batteries. Now, I picked this topic to start with because of all the stuff I'm going to talk about today. This has the biggest impact on how long your batteries are going to last, and it's also the time where you can put yourself in kind of a scary situation if you're not careful. So I'll give you a couple of hints and tips that you want to keep in mind when you're charging your cells. The first thing you want to do before you ever start charging a battery is do a physical inspection of the battery. I know that sounds kind of goofy to do that because you're thinking, gee, I just flew with it, it was working fine, but you want to inspect it, check the sides, make sure there's no swelling, there's no damage to the battery. You also want to check the connections. This is a Mavic 2 battery. Make sure that you didn't set it down in the grass just for a second and it picked up dirt or blades of grass in there. I keep a old toothbrush near my charging station where I can clean that off if I need to. I've also got battery guards that I use on my batteries. I'll explain that when I get into the transport section, but you just want to make sure it's in good physical shape before you actually put it on the charger, because if there's any swelling on that battery, you don't want to be charging it. You want to make sure that you put that aside like I showed you a second ago with that battery from the Mavic Air, and you want to discard that battery after you discharge it. But if the battery's in good shape physically and it looks okay, the next thing you want to do is check the temperature, because you never want to charge a warm battery. So if you've just flown your quad, you've run back inside, you've got a hot battery in your hands, you take it to the charger and start charging it, it'll charge, but it'll damage the battery tremendously by charging it hot. That's one of the worst things you can do to a LiPo cell, is have a hot battery and charge it, and you won't even notice it initially because you'll charge it, it'll hold a charge, you'll go back outside and fly with it, but what you've done is reduce that ability to charge it over time. So maybe that last 35 charges you get out of the battery, you just gave up because you charged a hot battery. So never charge a battery hot. The next thing you want to keep in mind is when you're charging your batteries, do it in a dry and well-ventilated area. I would also suggest charging them on some kind of metal surface or concrete surface. Never charge them on wood because, again, if something untoward happens to these batteries and they burst into flames, that wood's going to act like kindling and it's just going to spread like crazy. So, and again, I'm not trying to scare you, but LiPo fires are a real thing, and it usually happens when you're charging your batteries. So that leads me to the next point. Never charge your batteries unattended. I know you can get lazy and put them out in the garage and charge them and be, I've charged them 100 times and they're fine. That one time where the battery's damaged and you're forcing electrons into that battery and it bursts into flames and you're in the living room and that battery's in the garage, bad things can happen pretty quickly. So you want to make sure that they're within eyesight of you when you're charging them. Now for me, I've got a charging station down in the basement. When I'm in the shop, I'm watching there on the bench, or if I'm up in my office, I've got a charging station there. So they're always kind of in my peripheral view that, heaven forbid something happens, I can react pretty quickly to those batteries. The last thing I'll say about the batteries is you want to charge them as close to when you're going to fly with them as possible. You don't want to charge these batteries 2 days before your flight day, because the chemical process that's inside there isn't something that likes to be sitting there with a full charge. So I typically charge the batteries the morning I'm going to fly, or maybe the night before if I'm going to be flying early the next morning. And I usually keep them in storage at around 25 or 30%, which is a pretty good place for LiPo batteries to be sitting. So fly with them, you'll discharge them to 20-25% of their capacity, put them back in the case, and when you're ready to fly the next Saturday, just charge them that morning before you go out. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the chargers that are out there, because these smart batteries, this is a Mavic 2. Now, obviously, what I'll call dumb LiPo cells don't have the brains built in that a lot of these newer quads do. You have to charge those with a balanced charger, and you have to make sure you set the current and the voltage correctly for the cells you're charging. It's a little bit more work to do that. You're lucky that if you've got a quad like this where it's got a smart battery, a lot of the electronics inside the battery will control how the charge is ingested by the battery and how those electrons are spread across the different cells inside the battery. It's also got protections built in for overcurrent, over voltage, temperature sensors built in. So it's really smart enough to know that if you're firing electrons at it and conditions aren't right, it's going to stop charging and it'll protect you from major danger. But most of the time, when you buy a quad, you get a charger like this that'll charge a single battery. And that works really well. You connect it up, plug it into the wall, and you start charging. The problem is, if you fly a lot, you're going to end up with 2 or 3 or 5 batteries in your kit, and it's a real pain to have to slice them through and swap them out on that charger. You're going to spend hours, rotating those batteries through. So if you look around a little bit, a lot of the companies out there make these charging hubs, which allow you to use the original charger, plug it into the bottom, and you can slide up to 4 batteries in it. The challenge with these hubs is that even though 4 batteries will fit in there and you can charge them sort of simultaneously, they don't charge every battery at the same time. So they'll start with 1 battery and walk through all 4, and typically charge the battery that needs the least amount of charge first, then go to the next one, the next one, the next one. And that's a great way to put all 4 of them on there, get to your desk, you can do your work, and they're off charging on your behalf. A better solution would be one of these multi-chargers. Now, we carry these in the shop. The multi-chargers are great because they charge all the batteries at the same time. So this one's a 4 battery charger, which allows you to hook up 4 of the Mavic 2 batteries to it, and actually 2 other USB devices, plug it in and charge everything in one shot, which is really nice. This charger also has a lot of intelligence built in to understand what the capacity of the battery is, how much charge it needs for that particular battery, and it'll adjust that on the fly to give you the perfect charge for the batteries that need to be recharged. So that's a much quicker way to do it. I will caution you that I'm not afraid of third-party products. We sell third-party products, but if you're going to buy a charger like this or a car charger from a third party, make sure that it's a company you can get a hold of, because there's a lot of chargers out there that look like this that don't work like this. So, we check everything we sell on our website. I'm not trying to turn this into a sales call, but we do check everything. We stand behind everything. And the chargers we sell for these multi-chargers work really, really well for the batteries, and they'll charge them safely and allow you to get the best use out of them long term. So that's pretty much all you have to keep in mind. But the point I'm trying to make is when you're charging the battery, you have to think of this as sort of a chemistry experiment going on your table in your home. You're forcing electrons back into that battery, reversing that chemical process I described a few minutes ago. And that chemistry experiment sometimes can go awry. So you want to make sure that you do the best you can to keep the battery in healthy condition before you charge it, and you stay around that chemistry experiment while you're charging it. Just, again, heaven forbid something goes crazy, you're there to take action and react to it. The other things I'm going to talk about are a little more passive, where you typically don't have those kind of dangerous conditions, but charging a battery is where all the magic can happen and some of the bad stuff can happen as well. So just keep that in mind. The next biggest threat to your LiPo cells is temperature. And I can promise you, if you expose your batteries to extreme temperatures, either too hot or too cold, even for short periods of time, you can cause damage to those batteries, and that damage may not show up for a while. But what you'll find will happen over time is maybe you're getting less recharge cycles out of it, or you're getting less flight time when you put your quad up, and in some cases you can kill the battery outright just by storing it in a really harsh environment. So knowing what temperature these batteries are at all the time is really important. And that's not just when you're charging them, it's when you're storing them, transporting and using them. You want to make sure you've got a moderate temperature. So how do you know what's the right temperature? Well, the rule of thumb I use, and it's kind of a goofy analogy, but it works, is I want you to think of the battery as a small little beautiful puppy. And think in terms of what you would do with that puppy. So if you're going out to fly for the day, would you leave that puppy in your car while you were flying your quad? You wouldn't do that. You certainly wouldn't put the puppy in your trunk. Well, don't do that to your batteries. And the same thing's true in the wintertime. So if you're thinking, well, I'll store that quad out in the garage for the winter, no big deal. No, you wouldn't put the puppy out there in the middle of the winter. So keep them in a moderate environment. Don't abuse the puppy. Don't abuse your batteries. Make sure that they're comfortable most of the time, because they'll serve you well if you keep them at a reasonable temperature. Now, that brings me to my problems here with the Mavic Air. I mentioned before that I've got a dead Mavic Air battery that's got a big puff on the bottom of it. Totally my fault, and I'll explain what happened. So I was in Florida a couple of weeks ago, and I was flying down there, and I was driving between locations. In the morning, I was flying my Mavic Air at one location. I got a bunch of beautiful footage, and I was driving to a second location to fly my Mavic 2. Now, I had my Mavic Air in the car in the front seat, air conditioning blowing across. It was a very comfortable car, but as I was driving, I pulled up next to this beautiful lake, and I thought, man, I want to get some shots of that lake. So I pulled over, fired up my Mavic 2, put it up in the air. I swear it wasn't more than 10 or 15 minutes of flying. Came back to the car, put all the batteries back in the box, turned on the air conditioning, and drove to my next location. Now, when I went to charge this, when I got back to New Jersey, there was nothing wrong with the battery. It was working fine. I didn't see any bulging. Everything looked great. I charged it, and when I took it off the charger before I put the batteries back in the case, Lo and behold, I've got a big bulging battery. Now what that tells me is that suffered some damage probably during that heat period when it was in the car for 10 or 15 minutes. And the battery's punishing me for that. It's saying, look, you abused me. You didn't respect my LiPo technology. You put me in a really hot environment. The chemicals changed. Now you're charging me. You got to be kidding me. So the battery's not happy. And now I have to discharge the battery and take it to a recycling center. And it's a $50 mistake. So again, what I'm trying to show you here is that even guys that fly every day make goofy mistakes like that. And even in that short amount of time, it can cause that kind of damage to a battery. So just be really, really cautious and conscious of where you're flying and what the temperatures are for the batteries. And again, that goes for charging, like I talked about a minute ago, transport, storage, and actually when you're using it. One other thing I'll tell you about temperature, which is really important, is that it affects the way the batteries respond. So the way they take a charge and the way they deliver a charge back. And what you'll find, if I had a choice, is if I'm going to abuse a battery, never abuse a battery, but if I was, I'd err on the side of colder, because cold does less damage to a LiPo chemistry than hot does. If you store a LiPo battery in a trunk for a day, you might as well take them out of the trunk, take them to a recycling center and call it a day, because you're not going to get that battery back. The damage you're going to do to the LiPo chemistry boiling in that trunk is going to be irrecoverable and it's permanent. But when you're flying the quad, it's interesting how the batteries react differently to different temperatures. So for example, if you're flying in cold weather, which I do a lot here in New Jersey, I keep the batteries on the inside of my jacket next to my body to keep them somewhat warm. And that way when I'm ready to fly, I take it out of my jacket, put it in the quad, put it up in the air and fly it. I'll take the battery that came out of the quad, which is cold because it's been up there at elevation, and put it back in my jacket and kind of keep it at a moderate temperature. What you'll find when you fly in the winter is that the LiPo chemistry is very dependent on temperature. So it performs better in moderate temperatures than it does in cold temperatures. It slows the reaction down. So what'll happen typically, my experience is, when I put a quad up in the wintertime, that first 50% of the battery life, which basically comes down sort of in a linear fashion, so you can see it at 98, 96, 94, it comes down nice and slow, and you can kind of predict how much time you have left in the air. What I find is, when you get to 50%, all bets are off, because the quad's been up in that cold environment, the battery's getting cold, and from 50% down to zero, it might go to 50%, and right away go down to 20%, and then you're panicking because you're getting a return to home alarm. So my recommendation is, if you're flying in cold environments, warm up the batteries inside your jacket, put them in the quad. When you get to 50%, either keep it close to you or keep a keen eye on that sort of battery charge, so you know that, oh my gosh, it's really making changes here and I got to get it back quick. Warm environments are just about the same. The only concern I have with warm environments is the battery has a very linear decline as far as the discharge goes, but you have to be careful to not keep flying too many times in a row. So if it's a really hot day, you put the quad up, you fly through one battery, land it, take that battery, put it someplace where it can cool off, and feel the quad, because that quad's going to be hot. And if you slap a battery in there, that heat's going to transfer to the battery. So I always like to give a couple of minutes between flights. I don't land it, put another battery in, or fire it back up again. If it's a medium temperature, I'll do that, but on hot days, I definitely don't do that. So let the quad cool down a little bit, slap a battery in it, and then put it back up. Usually it's a 5 or 10 minute operation to give the quad time to cool off, and that works out pretty well. So that's pretty much it with the temperature. Again, remember the puppy. Think of these guys as little beautiful puppies. Treat them as such, and you'll have batteries that'll last you a long time. They'll give you full charges, and you'll stay up in the air a whole lot longer just by treating these with a little bit of respect. How you store your batteries can have a major impact on their long-term health. So it's really important to find a safe and dry location at home where you can store these guys between flights so they'll be ready for the next time you want to use them. There are a couple of best practices around storing your batteries that will guarantee you get the maximum use out of them and the longest lifespan possible. The first thing you want to do is never store your batteries at full charge. Even though a lot of the newer batteries like this Mavic 2 battery are smart, meaning if you put them in the case at a full 100% charge and don't use them for a couple of days, they'll actually discharge themselves slowly over time to get them down around that 30% mark. But you don't want to force the battery to do that. That's something you should be doing as an operator. So what I recommend is, when you fly for the day, you'll probably end up with the battery around 20-25%. Leave it alone. Just take it home, put it in your storage location at 25%. The next time you want to fly, you'll have to charge them. But that 25 to 35% is really that Goldilocks zone for storing batteries. That's where the LiPo is the most comfortable. It's not working because it's got a full charge in it, and it's fairly comfortable at that particular charge level. So around 25 to 35% is where I keep my batteries. And again, if you're goofy and you forget to do that, the battery in most cases will take care of itself and bring it down to that. But when it's doing that discharge, it's getting hot. And we talked about temperature already, so you don't want it to do that. Just store them at 25 to 35%. A dry location is super important. A lot of times people think, well, I'll put them in my basement because that way the kids won't mess around with them. A lot of basements are wet. You don't want to be storing batteries in a wet environment because LiPo technology and moisture is a really bad combination. So find some place that's dry and safe. That's my next point. So batteries stored like this on a shelf are not a good idea because, again, we talked a little bit about the LiPo combustion. If this thing bursts into flames, there's nothing to stop that flame from spreading and causing other issues in your home. So my recommendation is when you're storing your batteries, either go for one of these inexpensive LiPo bags, which are fire retardant. It allows you to take the battery, slide it inside the LiPo bag, and then store this on a shelf, again, preferably some type of metal shelf, not a wooden shelf. And that way, heaven forbid, something really bizarre happens with the battery and it bursts into flames, the LiPo will contain that fire as much as possible and won't allow it to spread. And again, not having it on wood means it's not going to heat up the wood below it and get it in trouble as well. Another thing you can do with storage, a lot of guys like to use ammo cases. Those metal ammo cases, or even a toolbox will work if you got a big metal toolbox, is the best case would be to put it inside the LiPo bag, put it in the toolbox, then you're doubly safe that if, God forbid, something happens to the battery, it's at least contained inside that metal toolbox. But don't just take the battery, put it in the basement on a shelf, especially a wooden shelf, because you're just asking for trouble long term. Now, you may get lucky and never have a problem, but what are the chances? I mean, I wouldn't risk that kind of danger in my home. I would take a couple of precautions. Another thing I would recommend is if you can pick up a set of these battery guards. I like these as well. And again, I'm talking about stuff that we sell on the site. The reason we sell it is because I use this stuff and I recommend it to other flyers. But these battery guards basically fit on the bottom of the battery. They go over the terminals, which means nothing's going to get at those terminals. It's impossible to short those terminals. Now, you would argue that, well, gee, Rick, if I have it inside the LiPo bag, how am I going to short the terminals? Well, you won't. But putting it in there with that on there means I have battery guards, a LiPo bag, and a metal container. And maybe I'm being super, conservative here. I'm a kind of a belts and suspenders guy. I like to have that backup plan every time, but I know that I'm not going to have issues. I sleep very well at night. No, my LiPos are in a metal case in the basement that's dry with this battery bag around it with those battery protectors on it. The last thing I'll say about storage is that you got to visit your batteries often. You got to go down there and talk to them and see how they're doing and check them. So if you're not going to fly for a couple of weeks, go down to the basement or wherever you're storing those batteries and just hit the button, right? And if you see this down to one blinking light, that means it's really getting low to a discharge. Put it on the charger for a little while, bring it back up to 30 or 40%, put it back in the bag and put it back in that can downstairs. Because the worst thing you can do is have these things fully discharged while they're being stored. And a lot of times if you have a lot of quads, like I have too many quads to fly, I'm always forgetting that one quad that I haven't flown in a couple of months. And then I race down there and I check it, and sure enough, the battery's down to 1 bar and it's blinking. It's basically saying to you, hey, you better charge me or this battery's going for good. So check them often, visit them often, put it on your calendar, maybe put it on your phone to say, hey, I haven't checked my batteries in 6 weeks. Let me go down there and see how they're doing. Now, that's probably not the case for most of you guys, because if you're like me, you're flying every day and you've got a bunch of different quads out there, but that's something you definitely want to do because it's happened to me before where I forgot about a quad over the winter. I flew it up until the fall, put it in the basement, a nice dry basement, and stored it for the winter. And I remembered right around January, oh my gosh, that quad down the basement, I haven't talked to it in a couple of months. I went down there, I had 5 batteries, 2 of the batteries were dead, and I couldn't pull them back from the dead. There's no such thing as a zombie effect with a battery. When it's gone, it's gone. That's pretty much it. So that's all I really had to do with storage. Just be smart about it. Again, don't store them in wet locations. Don't store them on wooden shelves. Put them in a LiPo bag or some kind of metal container. And that way you can sleep at night and not have to worry about any kind of scary LiPo stuff happening. This next section deals with the safe transport of your LiPo cells from your home to the location you're going to fly. Now that can happen in a car, and that can happen in a plane, and I'll talk about both of those scenarios, but there's a few things you have to keep in mind when you're traveling with LiPo cells, because even though you followed all the things I've talked about before, being aware of the temperature, storing them safely in a dry location inside of a metal container, when you transport them, all those rules apply as well. So if you've done the right thing and you've got them in a metal container somewhere in your house that's a safe and dry location, it should just be a simple matter of picking up that metal container, putting it in your car, being aware of the temperature, and driving to the location, and you should be good to go. It's a little bit different in a plane, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I can't tell you how many times I've flown with new flyers, and they'll show up at a location to fly, and I'll say, where are your batteries? And they're like, well, I got one here and I got a couple in the car. And I'm thinking, what are you doing? Leaving those batteries in the car. And then they run back to the car and bring them over, and they've got naked batteries like this. This thing's rolling around in the back of their car. It's banging up against the seats and everything else, or worse, it's in their trunk. And I'm thinking, look at all the fuzz you've picked up on those connectors that you're going to transfer over to your drone when you slide it in the drone. And on top of it, did you notice the crack in the side because it banged up against one of your seat supports underneath the back seat? The worst thing you can do with these batteries is pierce this outside shell, because DJI and a lot of the companies out there have done a great job of protecting the somewhat delicate LiPo cells inside this case with hard plastic on the outside. And they did that because if you pierce the case and you pierce that LiPo, the chemicals inside there do not do well hitting oxygen. That's when those lipo fires start. So if you crack the case, you see a split in the side, you got to get rid of the battery. Even if it's not swelling, I wouldn't trust the battery at that point. So just be smart about it. If you're using that metal case, or better yet, you got a hard case, transfer the batteries to your hard case, put it in your car, and go fly, and you'll be in good shape. If you got the metal container, that's fine, or use these LipoCell bags, you'll be fine as well. On a plane's a little bit different. Now, planes are interesting in that they'll let you take LipoCells on the plane. You can't bring them in the luggage compartment, so don't put them in your check bags. They have to go in your carry-on. You'll bring them on the plane. They'll typically want them to be as discharged as possible, which again, that 25% rule works pretty well. What I like to do too is I'll use these battery guards on them because that shows the people at TSA that I'm taking it seriously. I've protected these contacts in the bottom from shorting, so I'm not going to have any kind of problems with the battery. It just makes things a lot quicker when you're going through security. Then I'll slide them inside these lipo bags and I'll take them on the plane. Now, most airlines will let you take 2 of them without any questions whatsoever. I've had 6 on a plane and never had any issues, but some airlines are a little bit different than others. The FAA doesn't have a blanket rule. I think it's a minimum of 2, but the airlines can let you bring as many as you want. I'm sure if you walked on the plane with 30 batteries, they might have a question of what you're doing there, but I think an average collection of batteries of 4 or 5 would be perfectly fine. But take them on the plane with you, make sure you've discharged them, make sure you've got protection so they can't short, and they're packaged individually. And if you don't want to spend the money in the lipo bags, I get it, put them in a Ziploc, but keep them separate. Don't put them all in one big Ziploc, separate them in different Ziplocs, and that's really just showing the people at TSA that you're a serious pilot, you understand there are some risks involved with LipoCells, and you're taking every precaution to not put anybody's life at risk when you're up there 30,000 feet in the air. And that's pretty much it about safe transport. If you follow these rules, you'll have no issues whatsoever, and again, your batteries will last a really long time. I call this last section activity, and it has to do with being mindful of your batteries. I know that's kind of a new age term, but what I mean by that is that these batteries need attention. They have to be looked after, they have to be cared for, and a lot of times if you're flying every day, they're in your mind because you're out there flying, you're charging them, you're discharging them, you're wondering how you can charge them faster. So you're involved with them and you remember you've got batteries. What happens though is fall comes, September, October, whenever it gets really cold in your area, you put the quad away. And then maybe you get busy with other stuff. Maybe you're a ski guy or you like to take trips or whatever. And all of a sudden 6 weeks go by and you haven't touched the batteries and they're dying. They're starving to death. They need attention. They need to get that nutrient. They need to be charged. And if you forget about them, they're going to die a slow death in that case. And you're going to come down there when you do remember about them, pull them out of the case, hit the button a bunch of times in desperation, and no lights are going to come on. Then you're going to think, oh my gosh, what do I do? How do I get this back? You can't get it back. Once these batteries discharge, LipoCells, there is no way to kick them back into life. So you'll see articles on the internet about how to kick a LipoCell back into life. Don't believe any of them. The chemistry is absolute. So when they're done charging and you can't get a charge into them, they're done. You got to get rid of them at that point. So all I'm saying is, visit your batteries regularly. I mentioned in one of the sections before, I've been guilty of this, as a lot of my friends have as well, where you get maybe 3 quads or 4 quads, and there's one you love. It's a brand new quad, you're flying it every day, and maybe you've got the one you flew last time, and you take it out and you fly the 2 together, you got a friend that flies with you, but that 3rd and 4th quad don't get the same attention and love that your first 2 quads do, and those are the ones that are gonna have battery issues. So, I mean, I can't tell you how many times it's happened to me where I forgot about a quad for a couple of weeks, I went down there and said, oh man, I'm gonna go fly that Bebop 2, I went to get it off the shelf, battery's dead, and there's no way to get it back. Then I'm looking at it going, am I gonna spend 40 bucks on a battery for this? You know, maybe I'll just fly with 1 battery. Don't deal with that. Just pay attention to the batteries and visit them often. Another thing I'll tell you is it's important how you use the batteries when you're flying. So what I do with my batteries, actually this is a new one, I haven't labeled it yet, but most of my batteries have a number on the back of them. So I'll have, for example, I have 6 of the Mavic 2 batteries. I've got 1 through 6 on them. What I'll do is rotate those through both my charging and flying. So in my case, I've got 1, 2, 3 on one side, 4, 5, 6 on the other side. I'll fly in a typical day with maybe 1, 2, and 3. If I fly with 4, then okay, that's 4 batteries I flew that day. If I go back out the next day, even though I fully charged those first 4 batteries, I'll fly with 5, I'll fly with 6. And what that's doing is rotating the stock so that all the batteries get about the same charge over a period of time. They're all getting charged and discharged on a regular basis. It keeps them healthy. It's like exercise for batteries. So label your batteries and rotate through them as you're flying. That's super important. The last thing I'll talk about is usage statistics. You can, in most applications, DJI is real good with this, Evo's got the ability to do it, I think Anafi's got it as well, but there's a page inside the actual application where you can call up the battery statistics and it'll show you the health of the cells, because these are not single cell units and typically there are 3 or 4 cells inside there, and you get a graphical representation of how those cells are charged compared to each other. You want to look at those stats on a regular basis to make sure there's no errors, make sure the cells are charging equally, and if they're not, there's some procedure procedures, and I've done clips on this, where you can actually reset the batteries to a factory reset to reset those counters, and that may be something you have to do. Technically, it just means discharging the battery till the lights blink out, and in the case of DJI, there's a reserve charge inside there, about 15% of the battery, that will never go away. It will go away over time, but it'll basically be off, but there's still 15% reserve in there that the controller can see. You can then recharge it at that point and reset all those counters. But check those statistics, because that'll give you a lot of information about the health of your batteries, well beyond what this button up top will tell you, which is a really simple way to check how much charge is in it. That'll tell you how many charges you've had, how many maybe you have left, what the condition of the batteries are, and how those cells are charged compared to each other. But those stats are important to look at. So I recommend in the middle of the winter, a couple of times I'll go downstairs, I'll charge the batteries, I'll spin up the quad, I'll bring up that application, look at the health of the batteries, and maybe come springtime I have to replace one of them, but it's not going to be because I didn't pay attention to them over the winter. I can promise you that. And that's pretty much all I had today. Now, I know this is a longer clip than I normally do, but I wanted to make sure I gave you all the good news about batteries that are out there. I didn't want to scare you about the LiPo fires, but I have to talk about that because combustion of a LiPo product is a real thing, and it happens. It doesn't happen often. I've never had it happen to me or any of my friends, but I've seen YouTube videos where people have had it happen in a car or on the side of a road, and it's a miserable thing to have to deal with. So if you follow these recommendations I've given you in this clip, you'll be in really good shape, but more importantly, you'll get a lot more use out of your batteries. Nothing drives me nuts more than buying something that's expensive and not getting the full value out of over the time that I've owned the product. So you can do damage to these batteries without really knowing it. And what's going to happen is you're going to get less cycles of recharge out of it than you would normally, and that's going to get frustrating a year from now. So follow these rules, you'll be in really good shape. If you have any questions about anything I've covered, drop them in the comments below. I promise to get back to you as quickly as I can. If you're interested in any of the products I've covered, whether it be the chargers, the LiPo bags, the battery protectors, any of the stuff I've covered, obviously we sell them on the website. If you want to support the channel, you can hit the links below. You can go there and take a look at those products. And if you want to pick something up, you can support the channel by buying it from us. And again, I know you can find them all over the internet, but the difference is we stand behind everything we sell. If you ever have a problem down the road, we're here to help you. We're here to answer questions. So it's just a good thing both ways. I want you guys to get products that are valuable, that really work, that I've tested myself. And that's all I'll list on the website. And that's pretty much it for today. Now, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We've been growing by leaps and bounds. We love new subscribers, and I love having conversations on the channel. So drop your comments below. I'll get back to you. We can have a conversation about anything you want to talk about. And that's it. So thanks again for watching. And until next time, happy flying.